Welcome everybody, I'm Kyriakos Gold and this is Autistic Pride Day Symposium in Melbourne in 2024. We have a range of sessions today. Our first panel focuses on neurodivergent practitioners' perspectives, insights and innovations. Let's go to our panel. Hi Judy, hi Naomi, how are you?
Well,
I should say doctor.
all good.
All good.
Naomi's fine.
You were here last year, so I just want to start with what has changed since last year for you as a practitioner. And we'll start with Naomi, just alphabetically.
Yeah, so I think what's changed for me in a year is I'm sort of, I guess, another year on from, from my own sort of autistic identification, which means that there's a lot more sort of processing that's happened, a lot more sort of integration of sort of who I am, but also who I am sort of, professionally and, as a therapist. So that's, I'm a year further on in the journey.
How does that feel?
Incredible.
Is it bumpy or is it just like linear?
Yes, no, it's very bumpy. But yeah, I think, it's look, I often talk about, having like a real sense of sort of relief and kind of, that real validation in sort of understanding, yourself. But there's also a lot of sort of unpacking to do, in reverse when, you've got 49 years of understanding yourself sort of. So it can be a bit bumpy because there's a lot of questions that you ask yourself, both, in your personal life, but also, professionally as well.
Judy, what was last year's experience here for you, hearing all those openly autistic people talking about their experience, and how does that relate to your practice?
I was just talking to that. I loved it. It was amazing. It was just so nice to hear a lived experience as everyone's kind of processing their own journey, but also society's journey through autism and our understanding of it. So I found it really fascinating. And it was really interesting you talking about unlearning or unpacking kind of all the stuff that we had learned before, because as mental health professionals, I actually think we have a lot of unlearning to do around autism and restructuring our understanding around neurodiversity, which is quite a new term itself.
I've been having some intense discussions on my TikTok with practitioners that may be neurotypical or and talking about the importance of lived experience. Is it that important? What do you think, Naomi?
Yeah, so look, I think it's really valuable. I don't think it's essential if you're really willing to kind of know and understand and really connect. Like, we've got some magnificent neurotypical allies that are really on board. Yeah. So it's really helpful to have the lived experience and really valuable. And I think to have our voices heard and always as part of the conversation. But yeah. Allies are really important.
How does that understanding affect the diagnosis process?
I feel like there's a deeper understanding or more of an innate connection to the diagnosis and the process. And perhaps in some ways, I don't know about you, but for myself, in terms of, connecting with other neurospicy people, you're like, cool, I get this. That's.
I like the term spicy.
I love it.
It makes me feel
I love saying
tastier.
neurospicy. But in that sense, it's that comfort of knowing that someone else kind of knows you, not just through a checklist, but as a person, as a whole. Yeah.
How important is lived experience?
Yeah, so lived experience is really important. There's a lot to, a lot that we can contribute sort of through lived experience. And I think, it's really important to sort of have our voices, our voices heard through that lived experience. And I know, when I'm working with, with clients, with other, neurodivergent, autistic professionals, that it's really, that lived experience is really beneficial in, in connection and in understanding, and, it makes the work easy.
You also shared some quite, wonderful wisdom around the
Allies. Yes. Yeah.
So does that mean that we don't go to neurotypical doctors, or?
No. And look, I think, there are some magnificent allies that we have who, understand, who really take the time to sort of know, to hear us, to, I like to use the metaphor, of a bridge, and, maybe we're on one side of the bridge and they're on the other side, and, they're the humans that will meet us kind of halfway, sort of on the bridge.
I always say that phrase, that it's about meeting each other halfway, because so far I feel that autistic people have had to just walk the whole bridge, and even in my experience, even in governance, in boards where you are maybe the token autistic person on the board, it's still not accessible. And I can only imagine what it's like in your practice.
Yes. Yeah.
So let's talk about the word treatment. For me, it's a loaded word. Like, I don't want to be treated. I don't want to be changed. What is a practitioner's view on that?
That's well, because we were just chatting before about unlearning a lot of our understanding previous teachings around autism, not neurodiversity, the autistic ASD. So, I think in a societal sense, there's especially in the last year, I feel quite a shift around not just understanding diversity, but also identity, or autism as an identity. And that then has moved into the health profession trying to understand the spectrum as a whole. For too long, the mental health profession have just really focused on the treatment, like the one particular section of people with autistic people, where they do need supports, they do need that extra scaffolding and structures around them. So do we call that treatment? I'd probably prefer to call it something else, the supports.
I mean, support and treatment are two different words, right? Like very different, philosophy behind them. So
treatment is very like a medical model term. And now autism is coming to become quite much more of a societal, would you say? A social construct, yeah.
Well, if it is a disorder, you have to make it orderly. Maybe it's the word that frames the whole conversation. I know of a lot of autistic people that don't like to use the word disorder. We don't use it on our website. If it's anywhere on the website, please let me know. But what are your views on that as practitioners? I mean, you can't defy the models that you use for diagnostics.
No. So I think I agree with Judy that, it all comes very much from a medical model, and even the word treatment sort of comes from that. So when I trained 20 years ago, I trained as a counselling psych, which means that I was trained from a humanistic model. So, even, the word treatment in that model, we don't love it. So we talk more about, supports and, my work in that space is to, really kind of facilitate, well-being, and kind of really understand who it is that, that's sitting with me in the space when we're working together. So, when I'm working, or, when we're working with anyone, but if I'm working with autistic humans, it's not something that needs to be treated. What we're typically doing is actually working with mental health, with with emotional well-being, with helping somebody kind of work out how to thrive in the world. So I don't like the word treatment at all.
No, I just wanted to quickly say that treatment implies curing something. So it's saying, okay, autism is a disorder that needs to be cured. You need to be made unautistic with a treatment. So that's why treatment is so uncomfortable. And the antithesis, oh my gosh, there's a word, I can read it in my head, but it doesn't know how to come out of my mouth, of what we're trying to do, which is help people live the best life on their own terms, being who they are.
What is holistic practice? Like, I mean, it's such a jargon word sometimes, but what does it really mean for practitioners?
Oh, I absolutely love that question. So, look, what I think it means for practitioners is looking at, you know, the whole human, like in our unique entirety, but also looking at each of us. So, you know, it'll be, you know, mind, it'll be physical, it'll be, you know, all aspects, but then also looking at us in the context that we kind of, you know, live and sort of function in. So, you know, our, you know, families, our friendships, our communities, our workplaces, you know, and society sort of more generally. So I think holistically is sort of looking at every part of what makes somebody, you know, and impacts on who somebody is.
Judy, what do you think?
I wanted to say, golfing on them, as a neuropsychologist, we're actually quite diagnostic centric, which means unknowingly or sort of not unintentionally, we probably end up having a bit of that medical disorder, therefore treatment kind of lens that comes through. I know I'm jumping topics. I think that's something to just be mindful of, that's what I need to unlearn a lot of the times, because we do follow a bit of a checklist in our heads, or, you know, in the manual and so forth, around what is autism and what levels of supports they need. So we do a lot of work with NDIS and so forth. Taking that into account, a holistic approach is exactly what Naomi mentioned. You know, it's not just the person within themselves, but it's also how they, within the context that they find themselves in their immediate everyday lives, but also this wider society in itself and how that impacts on them, and really taking all of these things into account to then give a really comprehensive picture of them and their lives.
If there was ever a conference that you jump topics, it's this.
Is this one that we can do? Perfect. That's why I'm here. Yeah, absolutely.
And in that spirit of jumping topics, like before when you were talking, I almost felt like autism is now also recognized like a culture. Is that like a social construct?
Well, that's an interesting thing. Yes, and I think as mental health professionals or health professionals, we're now in this stage of trying to balance and really reconcile that, because certainly it's a spectrum, right? There are people who don't need supports and actually thrive in their autism, as far as I'm concerned, within society, and then there are those that require the support. So how do we share that message?
And if anyone, I know you're not here with your commissioner hat, but you are a commissioner at the VMC, at the Victoria Multicultural Commission. If anyone knows about cultures and expanding through those and policy, that's you.
But I love it. I think it's a great culture that we should really.
Do you see any policy changes coming in that space? Is that something that, to the extent that you can share, that government or that government space is considering?
See, that's really interesting. I literally, a couple of days ago, in my autistic hyper-focus kind of thing, I think I came across something in Ireland. Ireland actually was doing some autism strategic innovation kind of thing for themselves around as a country or as a society, how they would make their country or society more autistic friendly or helping to thrive. So that's the sense that I got. So I don't know whether Victoria or Australia has that at this stage, but it seems like some parts of the world are doing it. So we have a huge opportunity.
Hello, Victorian government. We're not funded for the last 2 years. Just letting you know, and everyone that's watching, if you want us to keep on doing free content, please donate. In terms of innovative practices, what are some that you can share with us? How does that innovation look like? Because in conversations backstage, we were talking that we might be living in a neuroaffirming bubble in Australia. And how, like, what are those practices and how do we differ than the rest of the world as far as you as a practitioner can see?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, you know, as far as I can see, you know, I kind of feel that we are sort of, we do seem to be a little bit ahead in terms of our, you know, in terms of our pride, in terms of our, you know, acceptance, in terms of our kind of, you know, really, you know, working hard to help, you know, autistic people thrive as much as we can in the world. And I think, you know, it's interesting because I'm sort of thinking or seeing innovation in terms more of kind of the unlearning and the unpacking.
Just about to say that. Yeah, nice.
Yeah. So, you know, it's more about, you know, being able to, you know, unpack what we think we know about, you know, the way things should be done from my point of view, you know, the way we might approach therapy, and, you know, really bringing it all the way right back to that really, you know, really kind of fundamental idea of two humans sitting in a room together. Who are you? Who am I? You know, how can I collaborate and facilitate, you know, you to thrive in the world? So I think the innovation is actually sort of in the understanding and in coming right back to, you know, who are you as a human? Who are you as an autistic human? And what do I need? How do I need to show up for you?
I think as a state and a nation, you know, compared to other places, we perhaps embrace diversity a bit more, and so and through that means, you know, a deeper understanding of neurodiversity and therefore embracing that. So I think that level of openness for ourselves has probably led to a bit of that more innovative willingness to have innovation and a bit of that change for everyone.
Yeah. Absolutely. And look, I might be side questing a little here, but the thing that always sort of shows up for me and has done, you know, especially since I identified myself and, you know, started to unpack everything, is that there's actually so much diversity within our divergence. So we're all different, and there's this beautiful kind of rich diversity kind of within us, you know, and within our community as well. And I think, you know, to really connect with that in the professional space is really important and really valuable.
One of the innovative stuff that I recently came across is embracing that diversity. So, you know, I think a lot of workplaces now think, okay, now we have a quiet space, but I've been to some places where it's like, okay, here's a quiet space and he's actually a stimulating space.
Or it's a place for people to sleep.
Yeah, or it's a place for people to sleep. So it's like, okay, we now understand that it's not just one way to be neurodiverse. There are other ways, and we're trying to accommodate that or provide sort of spaces for that as much as possible.
Is it easy to access a specialist here? And tomorrow we'll have a session about diagnosis, and I'll get you to talk about it in a minute. But just in terms of access, is it easy in Australia to access a practitioner or a neuroaffirming, if I could use that term?
Yeah, good question. I think it's getting, you know, in my sort of couple of years sort of in the space, it feels like it's getting, as we've got more understanding, I think it's getting easier. I think there are more of us, you know, who are really sort of engaged and practicing in that way. We're not all the way there yet, but yes, easier than it was. Yeah.
I agree. I think there's more touch points out there, but what is lacking is a structure. So there's a lot more coaches, therapists, professionals out there providing touch points for diagnosis, which is wonderful. Also at the same time, but maybe this is me as a neuropsychologist talking, like I like a bit more structure, or that's probably the autism. It's a bit, no, I think your face. Fine, I get it. Yeah, a bit more structure around this is perhaps more of a gold standard, or the way that we should go about
Using
it.
all the right words,
Yeah.
gold, autism.
Yeah.
You talked about unpacking, some of those biases and some of those ideas that maybe you've been trained in. How does that look for you in terms of unpacking some of those things around comorbidities when we talk about autistic people and we talk about other conditions that are related to being autistic as well?
Speaking from a neuropsychology kind of perspective, it's been tricky. It's been tricky because I have... I tend to see a clinical population, and so then I get a lot of questions coming to me that are medical focused or needing that support coming through. So I'm trying to juggle that lens or that I put on, and then coming out of that into the real world and seeing that there's more than just a clinical population. So personally, have I answered the question? It's harder for me. But also, I'm grappling with that over time, and hopefully next year I'll land in a different space.
Yeah. Awesome. So I would just sort of add to that, from my point of view, I think, really, having a good understanding of, what those might be, like what those kind of, those things like might be that we might experience. And again, it's kind of coming back to that sort of holistic view of sort of seeing you as everyone as a whole human, and understanding all those things that might be sort of, having an impact, and coming back from there. Yeah.
I have a question going back to the question originally about treatment. I was at an autism research conference a few weeks ago, and there was a session about profound autism, and I'm curious about the language and perspective on that, because I guess that model was, or the speaker was saying that there's too much emphasis on level 1 support autism and not enough on level 3, and maybe the language would be more towards the treatment side on level 3 and more towards support on level 1. Do you have any comments on that?
That's the unlearning bit, right?
Are you profoundly autistic?
I think you've just found the literal crossroads that the medical, the health profession are in at this stage. It's an awkward position to be in. and I think that's still going to take a year or 2 or 3 to really come to a proper consensus around that. That's probably the nicest way I can say it.
Yeah, Naomi? Be honest.
I'd love to say I agree with Judy. Like, it's I'm not sure that's I think there's so much around that, and I guess I'm sort of going around this a little, but I guess there's part of me that just wants to acknowledge what shows up for so many of us in our community with those conversations, and how deeply we feel.
Yeah, and probably in some ways, we'll talk about it has to be an intersectional approach. Again, my understanding with spectrum, there are some people where it's they're not thriving, but then it's perhaps a disabling an experience for them. So how do we support them through that? And that's terminology use. So if you're saying someone's profoundly autistic, is that helpful? I don't think so.
I just want to completely agree with what you said there, because I think it's really important to unpack, to steal a word from you guys, what they are talking about by being profoundly autistic. Are we talking about somebody who is also has intellectual disability? Are we talking about somebody who has extreme levels of dyspraxia? Are we talking about, is it incredible sensory sensitivity and overwhelm? So, it's not helpful, or in terms of supporting the person, if you just label them, because the spectrum isn't like a line of like severely autistic, really can't tell very much. It's that circle, which I'm sure everybody's seen, and within that, when somebody is experiencing severe disablement from whatever it is that they're experiencing, it's important to be able to unpack that into what are the areas and what supports do they need. So profound autism just doesn't tell us anything as a term,
And I think where we find ourselves at is where the disabled community also find themselves at, and sort of really moving away from, again, the medical model of disability to as a social construct, disability as a social construct in itself.
What is it going to take to shift from the unalterable characteristic, like many others we have, because none of us are one-dimensional, to thinking about what's the systems response that's needed, because we're still othering rather than we look at other diversity characteristics and we see what's happening in workplaces in a whole lot of ways to ensure that spaces are inclusive and responsive to our uniqueness as human beings. And I think, what worries me is, again, that we other this rather than saying, what is it about our systems and structures and who's informed those that continue to exclude? Rather than looking at it as, it's not othering, we're all different, but are we in continuing to, I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but yeah, the systems response, what's needed at a systems level.
I'm mindful also that the disability sector is quite, overwhelmed and burdened with the limitations and capacities for the capacity to care. And I think sometimes that perhaps looking at through that lens, so there's my gauge of it is there are some people within the caring community who feel very unheard with regards to the level of care that they need to provide for someone who does need that extra support. And what am I trying to say? By some members of the community saying there is no such thing as, profoundly autistic kind of, that might put these carers offside, if you know what I'm trying to say. So I'm just mindful that there are some people thinking, okay, but we do see people who do need those structures, who do need that support. How do we, not label, how do we identify and provide support from there without being othering, without being discriminatory?
So the theme of this year's campaign, because we've created a toolkit that is available to everyone globally to use before, during and after Autistic Pride Day on June 18, is taking the mask off. And I want to share what's been happening for me for the last 5 minutes. I got really upset when I heard profoundly autistic. I'm just quite upset right now. And the first thing that came to my mind, and I know that's gonna sound terrible to a neurotypical person, is that's just nasty. It's just really nasty. And when you tell people that do not understand our experience, they're like, oh, you're just overreacting. So it's just splitting us in parts. I don't feel better than somebody that has more mobility issues or does not have a verbal ability. I don't feel smarter. I feel my autism at its maximum at every moment of the day. Right now, I have a small meltdown through my body because of how triggering that was. And it's just difficult to explain to others that this is what's happening. So I really want to thank you, because as practitioners, when you join the discussion with us, taking the stigma off and saying, look, I'm proudly neurodivergent, this is what's happening, it gives our voice credibility. It really gives us credibility. Like just yesterday online, I was having an intense conversation with a practitioner that called me dangerous because of the way I felt about treatment and ABA. So it's just the world, the world is not a kind place at the moment for neurodivergent people. And maybe we are so privileged that we can have this conversation today in this safe space, but not everybody does.
No, and I'd say that's why it's so important to have it.
Yeah.
Kyriakos, I very much can relate to your experience about that. But I think what's happening is there is a portion of carers who have autistic children who have immense high needs, and they feel very unheard in the community. We see lots of on the surface, autistic people who are amazing advocates, and I don't think those higher need autistic individuals are getting the same type of exposure through the media, through social media, in print, and I'm wondering what your opinion is on that.
What do you mean by opinion?
There's a high portion of the carer community who have autistic children who have extremely high needs, and they aren't they feel that they aren't being represented as much as perhaps on the surface the autistic person who might seem to have lower needs. I know that's not correct because it's a spectrum.
We actually have a session on representations of autistic people in the media tomorrow, because I think either part of the spectrum, the ends of the spectrum, if I could use that words, are not represented. The autistic people that I think are represented are the ones that are slightly quirky, marketable enough, sexy enough to be loved on the spectrum. And we are going to have that discussion tomorrow, but in this space, can we have your opinion as well?
You just answered my question. Took my words. It is. I think within media, and then that changes public perception. You see both. Well, one spectrum of is those that have very high needs, and so a proportion of the public see that is autism, and therefore everything else doesn't. Yeah. Is not autism. And then there's also a movement, literally, it's a movement happening by the autistic community saying, actually, it's a spectrum and there are these people that are also autistic and we need visibility for that as well. And I feel for me that's a lot of that's in the social media realm. So it's almost that we have these two ends kind of competing and making noise about who's getting represented and who is the real autistic kind of thing. And then there's, we're just kind of fighting each other at the end of the day.
That real autism is, I think that the fact that I've had the same type of abuse, is people do not believe you because that's not what they think.
If I had $1 for every time somebody said you do not look autistic, this would have been a mega conference. Naomi, any final comments from you?
Oh, no, I think it's a really interesting consideration too, because I've had many people say to me, how can you as an autistic person, how can you be a psychologist as an autistic person? And
with great success,
with absolute success. how could I do what I do in the way that I do it unless I am who I am? And I'm autistic. It is who I am.
Judy, as your final words of the day, can you also give us a little bit of an insight on tomorrow's topic for the practitioners panel? It's about diagnosis.
Yes, it is. I'm very keen because just really going off on that, I just want to have a wonderful, more in-depth conversation around the health professionals' understanding of autism and how it's kind of, we've seen things shift. So really delving what we started talking about today in much more detail. Yeah.
Thank you both. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for watching. I'm Kyriakos Gold. This is Autistic Pride Day 2024. If you like our content, if you want it to still be free, please donate. See you soon.